Right now, we're basically saying in the privacy space that people need to use every app and use every service in a way of like, hey, is this going to kill me maybe? Hey, is this going to have an adverse effect on me? Maybe we get to a place where companies are so responsible with their data that we all decide that it's time to deprecate that. It's time to move on. But I feel like right now we really need it.
Hey Maritza, good to see you again.
Hey, it's good to see you too. Looking forward to picking up where we left off.
Yeah, me too. So last time we talked, we talked about kind of the dizzying pace of technology innovation. We talked about AI. We talked about the worry a little that hey, these things are moving pretty fast and it's cool, but have we thought about the safeguards, the guardrails for some of this? And since
Hmm.
then, there's now a federal privacy bill that is kind of batting around. It's passed the House, looking at the Senate. So I was hoping we could talk about that.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
excited to dig in on that.
I've got my coffee here. Maybe this show's called Coffee with Maritza. I don't know.
Oh, I have tea. I'm going mint tea. Keep things
Nice.
calm.
So a little about us again. If you're joining for the first time, Maritza and I are on the board of the Ethical Tech Project. We have an idea for the ethical use of the internet and helping consumers and businesses with the tools to make that happen. And the reason why we got this podcast is so that we can talk to people, raise awareness on data usage and privacy and AI and ethics and all that good stuff. So, Marissa, thanks for joining. So, the federal privacy law, well, first of all, I should back up a little bit. We have some privacy laws in the US. And there's like 15, I
Hmm.
think it's 15 or so states that have some kind of privacy law. California was the first. And the
Hmm.
idea is that when businesses use sensitive and personal data, consumers, people should have some control over how that gets used and some rights, essentially. The federal law is an attempt to just have now a national standard for some of these laws. So we're going to talk about that. There are some interesting pieces to this law. The first interesting piece was this idea of data minimization, which, if I'm
Yeah.
summarizing that right, it's something like, as a business, collect just enough data to do the thing that you want to do, and
Hmm.
no more, no less. Which I'm 100% behind. What are your thoughts on that, Maritza?
I love it. I'm always so glad to see data minimization at the privacy party. So I feel like it's like a really important tool that sounds almost like too simple and like too straightforward. And one thing that I always think of is summer of 2014. I was listening to Chris Soghoian give a talk about Android privacy and the data collection going on. And he had this awesome quote that was a riff on like, if you build it, they will come. So if you have the data, eventually somebody is going to ask for it, either another product team within the company, a partner, an enterprising coworker, or maybe the government's going to request it for an investigation. And the best answer, if you don't want to give up that data, is to say, we don't have it.
Mm. That's such an interesting take on it. It's the idea that it exists means someone's going to come after it. It. Look, I know this is still an allegation, but look, there's a I think it's a class action case against Meta. They've denied this, of course, but the idea was that that Meta has was giving Netflix access to direct messages, and
Oh,
you're kind
yikes.
of yeah you're kind
Whoopsie.
of they've denied it. They've denied it. And look, I'm not kind of making any claims here, but it's like this idea that even things like that, direct
Yeah.
messages, like it's once they're there, they're up for grabs, and maybe it's better just
Yeah.
not have it. Just snap to what you're actually doing with the data, what you've said you're doing with the data, what permissions you have for it. It
Yeah.
reminds me of we Connecticut was one of the other states up following California that enacted data privacy laws, and they went live in July. We were talking with Michelle Lucan, who's the data privacy chief over there. She works for the Connecticut AG.
Hmm.
She says, she's been kind of doing the rounds and talking to businesses and brands about their data practices. The two things were kind of alarming. She asked questions like, "Why are you collecting so much data? Why do you have so much?" To your point, Maritza, and then also, why are you keeping it for so long? Like some of this data was from years
Yes.
ago. And she was alarmed that businesses kind of shrugged, didn't have good answers for that. I don't know, just
Hmm.
Wild West, man. Like we're collecting data and we didn't know what we were doing with it. Like maybe it would come in handy later.
Yep. In my past experience of working on product teams and with product teams, I feel like those are the most alarming situations where you ask a question related to the collection, storage, use, deletion of data, and you get like a, ah, why are you, why'd you collect these 10 pieces?
It's the
Because
80s.
we could, like, it felt good at the time, or like, like, why not? And I feel like that, like, why not is not the answer you want to hear. Like, you want to hear there is a deliberate, considered reason for everything you're collecting, and also how long you're storing it and how you're storing it. I remember it's like play a lot of tennis, and our sports club has different apps. And at one point, I noticed that every check in at the gym is in this app for like the life of however long I've been a member. I'm like, that's just egregious. You don't need that data. Like, and it's
Yeah.
like a detailed timestamp. It's like door, date, time. Yeah, door, date, time for
Mm-hmm.
7 years.
Mm-hmm. Too much. It's too. That's exactly it. It's too much. Like
Like,
this
why?
data
Or rather,
minimization.
it's like, I don't even know if it's too much. I'm like, I just want to know why. Like, I want to, and then that's what really gets me. Like, what I want to do is call the product team and be like, why? Like, hi, I've noticed that you have all this data that's being stored in the app. Could you let me know, like, why? But
Mm-hmm.
then I can't find somebody to connect with. So it's like I have all these unanswered questions and they just eat away at me.
I think it's a mindset shift that needs to happen. There was hey, it's the 80s, we're all doing it. It's
Yep.
crazy.
Yeah.
And now, the FTC is who's going to be one of the big enforcers of this federal law.
Yeah.
They've been out there saying, "Hey, listen, this is going to stop." And the reason why I think of it as a mindset shift is for exactly the reason you mentioned. It's the status quo was something like, "Hey, let's just collect it. I'm sure it'll be
Yeah.
cool. I'm sure we'll do something with it with this data that we're
Yeah.
getting."
Yeah. It's like
And
storage is cheap. We're gonna, I don't know, maybe we'll use it. Like
maybe it'll come in handy. Yeah, it'll come in handy. Who knows? And so
my
now,
fave is when people are like, oh, Maritza, I don't know if you've heard, but data is the new oil. I'm like, no, no, you stop. No.
yeah, tell me about that. Tell me about that.
um, I feel like it's a poorly used metaphor.
Hmm.
Or rather, I think I mean, as a person living through like undeniable climate change, I don't think that we should be taking pride in wanting to exploit a resource in the same way we've exploited oil. So I feel like I get why people use it. It evokes exciting feelings of, like an oil rush and money and innovation and fueling the economy and, doing all these great things that we love as Americans. But also, I feel like there's undeniably a downside to this. And to me, like the irresponsible pursuit of a resource at any cost,
There's a
it's not
plunder.
worth it. It's
Yeah,
not
there's,
worth it.
there's a plunder slash exploitation angle to it. I think I'm with you when you compare it to oil. Also, it's like oil is a resource in the ground, and data is like kind of a little more personal than that.
It
It's
is.
us,
Oh, so one of
information.
my favorite blogs is Sketchplanations, and they
Hmm.
had a really great one a few months ago that was, are we talking about something that's like, is it like bacon or eggs? So is it, you know, when you eat it, or when you okay, I'm like searching for a word, when you harvest the food, when you get access to the thing you're going to eat, does it kill what you eat? Or is it something that's renewable, right? And I thought that was really interesting. So I'm like, for data, we're in privacy, we're always looking for good metaphors. So then I feel like I've seen, I've heard of a lot of ones like it's your data exhaust, it's your digital footprint. And increasingly, it feels much more personal than that. It feels much closer to some data and some uses of data feel much closer to bacon than eggs.
I'm with you. I'm with you. I love that. I wasn't sure where you were going with that, but
I don't
like, yeah,
know.
it's a
That's
it's
where
a
it stops being useful. Then it just gets really dark. So like Lisa Simpson would not be happy with me right now.
it's a proxy for us for sure, and I think there's so many reasons why that's important. It's like, for example, and just to like keep riffing on that, where it's there's this idea of like who owns your data, right? Do
Yeah.
you? One of the interesting applications of that is, some folks are rushing to get digital scans and downloads of themselves, right? So they could
Yeah.
basically have a digital avatar where, I might not have to talk to the real Maritza. I could just talk at some point to the digital representation of Maritza. And there's a really
Sometimes it might feel that way.
Are you real? No. So, so the idea is like, so what happens if you have a digital avatar and you die? Like, who
Oh
owns that?
yeah.
Does it go to? And it's an interesting way to think about it because does it go
Hmm.
to your heirs? Does it go to your beneficiaries? I mean, does the platform in which you recorded the avatar, do they
Hmm.
own it? Like, I don't know who owns these things, right? Like Microsoft or whoever ends up doing this stuff. Do they own
Yeah.
it? And if they own it, what can they do with it? And can they
Hmm.
use this download to market to folks? Can they market to your kids? Like, hey, here's what your
Oh,
dad wanted. Well, all right, kind of creepy, right? It's like
yes.
there's no safeguards, there's no like rules around that yet, and these are some of
No,
the thorny ethical questions we need to ask ourselves.
there's so much to think about.
So much, but anyway, but we've moved we've moved away
No, I
from.
think it's important because like what
Yeah.
you just brought up, it's to me, I think of it there's a big conversation we need to have about data collection and also data use.
And hey, if it's property, if it's somebody's property,
Yeah,
when you die, is it someone's property now? And who owns it? How
right.
do we think about that? To your point about the
See, I feel
bacon.
like that's where it gets really tricky though. Like I've in the past been in conversations with other privacy folks about the idea of owning your data.
Hmm.
And to me, I'm like, what does that even mean?
Right.
Like, I think about facial recognition, and the technology exists where you can, from a photo, identify or connect a photo in the real world to online profiles and pictures that you might find on like Google Images, for example. That exists.
Hmm.
So, what are you going to do about it? Like, my face is my face. I'm not going to radically change it, nor am I going to hide it, nor do I want to live a life where I'm needing to hide it. But I also want to have an expectation that that's not going to be misused. And like, what does that even mean? Like, that's not going to be misused. I want to be able to go into public spaces and I want to be able to go into my friends' houses without thinking that somebody's going to run a database search on me and who I am that I can't really ever control. Like,
Hmm.
I both can't control having a picture of my face taken, nor can I control the results and the accuracy of them. Like, I feel like we quickly slid into like an episode of Black Mirror. Is that what
It's
that
all,
show's called?
oh, it's all Black Mirror. No, I'm with
It's
you.
all
I
Black,
think
right?
for me, like the idea of owning your data is the ability to control it, and
To control it. Yeah.
it's the heart of it. And we can get into whether real data control is an illusion, but I don't think it is. Because we talked about the data ecosystem last time. Data gets out there. Sometimes you can lose the handle on it, but I don't think that's an excuse. I think people should have control over their data. We need the safeguards. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine, she's Indian, and the reason why that's important is she didn't have any US data for 20 or so
Yeah.
years. And she worked at a company that had technology to help businesses figure out insider threats. Like which employees at your company right now that could be a problem later, which I didn't know was a thing. And she said,
Yeah.
as I was building this technology, she ran her own name through there just to be curious, like, hey, I'm Indian. They probably don't know who I am. I'm not going to be in this database, right? Because my
Yeah.
data's not out there.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, she found herself, and she found a photo of herself at some kind of Earth Day event.
Oh,
And because she
yeah.
was at Earth Day event, no name or anything, it was all facial recognition, and they could tie
Mm-hmm.
and she had a small risk of being an eco terrorist for that reason. So there was
Right.
a number attached. I thought that was so crazy that
Yes. Yes.
there isn't really a data footprint. It was just facial recognition. You were at this event, and now
Yep.
because of the event you were at, hey, you care about the environment, there might be a small
Yeah.
risk for eco terrorists. Just seems to me to be a little too crazy. And maybe that's an
Yes.
of, eh, should we draw a line somewhere, everybody?
Mm-hmm. And then
Honest.
once you get that label, like how's it being used? Who's using it? And for what? And if it's,
Exactly.
Maybe she's changed. Maybe, a lot of things could happen.
Right.
But actually, so then I think this week is particularly interesting because as a privacy professional, I'll need to update a lot of my thinking around what's what based on the existence of a federal privacy law.
All right. So let's get to the second thing. The second big principle in the privacy law was transparency. And I know you
Yep.
have the time, Maritza. Like, and I wanted to ask you, what does that mean exactly? Like, is it? I've seen some of this in New York data privacy law drafts where they say
Yeah.
transparency means communicate to me about privacy at an
Yeah.
eighth grade level. Like, just
Yep.
tell me simply, what are you doing with my data?
Yeah.
What can I do about it? How do I stop you doing that or whatever? It's just transparency on data practices. How do you think about it?
hmm Yeah. Okay. I love this question. I feel like as we keep talking, I'm going to be like, I love all of these. These are all my favorite things. Can be, transparency can be a feature that companies choose to do well. And then I also feel that I've seen companies sort of weaponize transparency to be the least useful thing possible. And I'm thinking, for example, all right, so in some of my work, I show up as a user experience researcher. And the goal of a user experience researcher is to be a part of a product team and do what you can to ensure you're building a useful and usable product. So, what's useful, it gets a job done that somebody cares about. What's usable, that you can do it effectively, efficiently, and hopefully with some satisfaction. So that's like, can you achieve your goal at all? Can you get the job done? Can you do it in a reasonable amount of time? And can you do it without it feeling like you're having a lobotomy? When like I've worked at companies where they've been on the hook for implementing a transparency feature, and to me, it's always a question of like, to to what end are you providing the information? So transparency without the ability, like giving information to people without also building in support for agency, to me is just like wildly frustrating. For example, like my sports club app. Like by somebody's measure, they are transparent that they have all of my check-in data. But then once I've seen that, like I can't delete it. I can't ask questions about it. It's a straight up log of just every entry. So you can't, like I can't even really make sense of it. Like I know what it is because, it's check-in, door, time, whatever. But it's not useful. And then I've also had this feeling, for example, like looking at internet browsers that will let you see your search history. So they've
Mm-hmm.
gotten better. So you can like go in and view your search history. And then now some browsers will give you the ability to selectively delete some of your history. So before you'd have blunt tools, like you could delete all of your history, a year of your history, 3 months of your history, a day of it, that kind of thing. I was like, well, like, okay, as somebody who uses the internet, I'm like, I feel like you kind of know, like I feel like you're being cheeky here because your browsing history is useful. So I'm like, I don't want to just blitz the whole thing. But also like I want to remove that like one site that I accidentally clicked on or like that one site I don't want following me around everywhere. So in the past couple of years, we do have more of those style of features. And I feel like that's leaning in a positive direction, right? It's like, how do people want to use this thing? Actually, like when I see interfaces like that, I'm like, oh, I'm glad they probably had a user experience researcher or a designer on the team to help say, what would people reasonably want to do with this information? And let's build in a feature that supports them to get that done. So for me, okay, and then also it's like I just talked for however many minutes about transparency that would be used directly by any user, any person. I also feel like there's a benefit of thinking broadly about transparency in terms of other audiences. So regulators need transparency and they have a different eye, they have a different level of sophistication, they have a different rubric that they're going by. So I think transparency for regulators and external sort of verifying parties is very important. Like basically other groups who could lend kind of legitimacy to the uses of data is important. And those people, like their needs of a screen would be different from a user. And then I think also like third party partners. So if you're a business and you're sharing data with a potential new partner, you also have a need for transparency, which is different from, perhaps different from a regulator. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure in what way, but also different from a consumer. But you need to be able to, like, to me, I think it is critical that there is some level of transparency around data and the whole data lifecycle so that somebody who didn't write the code can actually answer questions about what's going on and also exert, basically like have, be able to have an impact, have some agency about either deleting the data, questioning the data, or correcting the data. There are probably some other things too. But like that's kind of broadly. Mm-hmm.
No, thanks, Maritza. I'm with you on the transparency needs some kind of follow up, some kind of agency, some kind of control. I love, from a consumer perspective, I love how Steve Jobs put it in 2010, where he said, look, privacy means people know what they're signing up for in plain English and repeatedly. He said, I believe
Mm-hmm.
people are smart. Some people want to share more data than other people do. We talked about this, right? There's a value exchange that let people understand what you're doing with data and have the ability to control it. But he said, ask them every time, make them tell you to stop asking them if they get tired of you asking them. Let them know precisely what you're going to do with their data. And for me, that's transparency. And sometimes it's just either businesses aren't telling you what they're doing or they're telling you in some really long legalese way. And so I think it's simple, right?
Oh
Maybe
yeah.
it's common sense on transparency. But yeah, but to your point about you need to follow up with something, and that's kind of the third thing in privacy law that I liked in this bill, which is they've 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 highlighted the rights that people have with their data, and to just name them quickly: the right to access your data, ask
Mm-hmm.
businesses, what do you have on me? The right to delete your data. Hey, I don't like that my sports club app is collecting all this stuff. I want you to delete it. And as a consumer, you should have the right to do that. And then, of course,
Mm-hmm.
correct it, take it wherever you want to. So this idea of agency, and that's a global phenomenon. It's happening in a lot of data privacy laws, especially the right to delete and access. I think it's almost in
Mm-hmm.
everyone. One of the fourth big pieces, and I know you can go deep on this one, is dark patterns, which is right.
Mm-hmm.
Let me try to summarize it, and then Maritza, I want to know how you feel about it.
Okay.
Dark patterns is essentially if you're asking people to consent to data use, then you should do that in an even and balanced way. And it's not like, hey, one button is bigger than the other kind of thing, or it's easier to opt in than it is to opt out. Like the whole idea of dark patterns is don't trick me into sharing my data.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think about it? Because I know this can get pretty tricky. Like, what is a dark pattern?
Yeah. Yeah. I love this question because I get to give my favorite answer, which is it depends. Like I
Mm-hmm.
feel like on a lot of these questions, the topics that we're talking about, there ends up being a nuance. Like in some cases, I think like on like the edges of the spectrum, like it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. So, the nice framing of a dark pattern would be it's a nudge. So, or it's choice architecture. So back in like the Obama administration, the Obama had elected, I can't remember what they called it. I think it might have been like the nudge patrol
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. And basically it's the idea that like using what we know from behavioral economics and cognitive science and psychology, humans make decisions in predictable ways. And actually, okay, now I just thought of like Dan Ariely's book, like Predictably Irrational. All humans were predictably irrational. So then, if you're a designer, if you're building products, you can leverage that information to kind of goose the result. And you can do it in subtle ways, or you can do it in sometimes I feel just like outright hostile ways. And like I use that word and I use it deliberately. I feel like some of these tactics are used to be sure that teams are hitting their quarterly targets. We need to know, we need to have X number of people who've signed up. We can't have Y number of people who've opted out. So we're
Mm-hmm.
going to push this through, whatever means necessary. And there are a lot of kind of tactics you can use in how you design products that kind of, for better or worse, force people down a certain path. And I mean, and I feel like unfortunately, it's like we see these all over the internet in our different experiences. So you'll see it when you're making decisions about subscribing to a newspaper. If you take a careful look at the different options, The options don't actually quite make sense if you figure out like what you're getting and what the cost is and like how things are displayed. I feel like it can feel like it's a little bit mind bending. But these things, the dark patterns also show up when we're looking at basically the way that apps and websites and companies ask permission for using our data. So like kind of the way that companies are implementing notice and choice.
Hmm.
It can feel like when dark patterns are used, you're not really getting notice, nor are you getting choice. But somehow, some way, the companies convince themselves that they are doing notice and choice. I feel like I didn't quite answer your question though.
No, you did. It's actually it's super interesting because one of the ways I've thought about this is so we I love using Siri in the car, right?
Yeah.
Give me directions to whatever, like what's my
Mm-hmm.
car today type stuff. And I asked Siri for directions, and she said, "Well, I can't do that until I have unless because you haven't given me access to precise location data." And I remember thinking, yeah, but I'm okay giving you precise location data if you're only going to use it for this thing, for
Mm-hmm.
mapping. And I wasn't super clear if this precise location data was going to be used for other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And location data, like the type of data starts to matter. Location data, health data, whatever the case may be. And like as a consumer, I want to limit where that's used. I want to be able to say, you can use precise location data, but only on the map. And I was
Mm-hmm.
curious if them not being able to do that, like is that a dark pattern in itself? Because that's just built into the design of the thing. And I don't know if dark patterns have been thought of in that way, but when you turn some stuff off, some data collection off, like your phone sucks. It just doesn't,
Yeah.
it's not cool anymore. And I want it to be cool, but I want to limit how the data gets used in getting it to coolness, if that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. And then I feel like here's where like I feel I know too much. Like I have really high expectations of companies that are asking to use my data to deliver services.
Hmm.
And I don't feel that they're unreasonable at all. Like that specific example that you gave. So it's a Siri app on an iPhone, and basically Apple has made decisions about the experience that they're going to offer you. And at the end of the day, a product team decided that it was not a priority to give you the option that you're wanting for whatever reason. I'm sure there are lots of reasons why. So, like when I think of like the long arc of how far we've come with both Apple and Android doing a better job of designing the data permission requests and also the tools we have for managing and understanding when various permissions are being used. I want to give credit where credit is due. So, for example, I'm thinking like at some point since 2007, Apple has introduced a new screen within settings where you can easily see all of the apps that have access to your location and you can turn it on and off. You can also go in and see kind of approximately which ones have recently used your location, which is nice. But then also, and then also today, now we have a dialogue where you can make a choice of sharing your location just this once, only when you're using it, or always, or you say no. But like you're saying, sometimes each of those options isn't provided or implemented as a viable feature in what you're using. So the ability, so I feel like, okay, on the one hand, it's super nice that Apple has now built in the ability to have more control over, like, more choices about how you're granting access to your location data. But then also, like, it's still not enough.
Hmm.
Like, when I think about how important your location data is and how useful it can be in a bunch of different situations, like, I still want more. Like, JJ, I love it that you, like, read the Steve Jobs quote about privacy. I don't feel like Apple's living up to that,
I'm wondering that myself. I've been
right?
wondering. Yeah, oh, totally, totally. And it's not
It's
just
frustrating because like they're out there
yeah,
positioning themselves like they're the champion of privacy. I'm like,
uh-huh.
okay, maybe like little p whisper privacy, but I want like capital P privacy, whatever that means. I just want it in a big way. Like I want to feel like I actually am interfacing with a company that respects how much trust I'm putting into them.
I want capital P as well. when I'm in San Francisco from time to time, drive down the 101 and come back from the airport, and you see the Apple billboard, and there's a face, and the face is obscured by an iPhone. It says privacy, that's iPhone. I'm like, great, that makes me feel good. But there's a Department of Justice action against Apple, like right now, that basically is accusing Apple of weaponizing privacy, and that all
Mm,
millions of dollars spent on privacy forward advertising isn't a real thing. And so let's talk about that as that case develops, because I'm with you.
yeah.
The other piece of it is I don't know if consumers have enough information to make these decisions. And what I mean by that is, as I look at this federal privacy law, one of the things I like about it is that it moves the obligation for data privacy closer to businesses. Data
Yeah.
minimization, as we talked about, transparency, as we talked
Yes.
about, it kind of recognizes,
Which is huge. Which is like
right?
I feel like up until this week, it's well, actually, until this bill is enacted, like we're all caught up in this crazy myth that it is my personal responsibility to
Hmm.
protect my data, if only I cared enough to do it,
Right.
which is just,
You're asking too much. You're asking too much of people. So
it's
it's
not
one of
even
my
possible.
it's one of my pet peeves about the European data law. Like I love that GDPR in Europe, kicked the door open on privacy and it really opened up the conversation. But one of the ways they did that is to say everybody needs to opt in to
Oh,
data
yeah.
processing. Like, and
Yeah.
and what happened, which I think is good, it's well founded, but it ended up turning into every website you go to has a long list of things that you got to say yes or no to. And I
Hmm.
asked myself, is this supposed to be informed consent, which was the intention of it? Like, are consumers really informed, or are they just saying yes so that banner can go away and they can get to the
Yeah.
data behind it? And I love this idea of don't put that burden on consumers. Just kind of do the
No.
right thing with data
Yeah.
minimization and transparency and other things, and take that cognitive load off us. We're gonna
Yes.
In another one of these sessions, we're going to talk about different types of data. And one of the things I've been obsessed with lately is data that your car is collecting.
Mm-hmm.
And one of
Mm-hmm.
the reasons I've
Which
been obsessed
increasingly
with
is a lot.
it's a lot. And I
It's a lot.
downloaded a little app that helped me figure out how much data my car was collecting. And basically, my car has 10 different data privacy agreements or data agreements attached to it. And it said that it would take 330 minutes to read all those. Like, look, really, is anyone really going to read those and make an informed
Yeah.
decision? Or how about you just tell me in simple terms what you're doing with the data? Give me a chance to say yes or no to it in a way
Right.
that doesn't trick me into saying yes. So
Yeah.
we'll jam on that in the next session because I think we're at a real turning point in consumers' understanding of what's happening with their data.
Yeah.
But kind of lastly on the federal privacy law, it talks about bias as well. Like
Mm-hmm.
when you're putting data into AI, when you're a business putting data into AI models, make sure the output of those models doesn't discriminate against people.
Yeah.
It doesn't discriminate, for example, against people of color. It doesn't. It provides people equal opportunity to get jobs. All that kind of stuff. And I thought that was super interesting because privacy law, it hasn't. I don't think it really has dealt with bias, but the AI conversation talks about bias all the time.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to me to see bias in a privacy law. And the way I
Mm-hmm.
understood that, Maritza, was I think privacy people are some of the perfect people. Privacy people in businesses today are some of the perfect people to take on the AI conversation
Yeah.
because they're comfortable with squishy laws, right? They aren't quite formed yet.
Yeah.
They are usually cross-functional.
Mm-hmm.
Like they work with technology teams and
Mm-hmm.
product teams, and they talk about how to inject privacy in those things. And I
Yeah.
think they can handle it a little better. So it's had some
Yeah.
criticism. Like, hey, what is this law exactly? What are you trying to do? Is it privacy? Is it bias? Is it AI? But I actually like
Mm-hmm.
so I thought that was cool. The other piece of it, what they call the private right of action. I'm interested in your thoughts on this. It's the idea that any person, any consumer who, where their data privacy rights have been infringed, has a right to sue that company. And it tells me two things. I know there's pros and cons with this. It tells me this is how important this thing is
Mm-hmm.
to
Yeah.
lawyers, to consumers, to give consumers that much power. I know
Yeah.
there's a downside. It increases class actions and you know, all that kind of stuff, the plaintiff's bar, and I'm leaning towards maybe that's just something that has to come with it. 'Cause I think the benefit outweighs the cost. But curious what you think.
On the private right to action, I feel that it's super important. Like
Hmm.
okay, so I can't remember if I've said it in this episode, but in our first one, I was talking about how like I've been working working in the space for close-ish to 20 years, and the times when we've had the most exciting and I feel momentous changes in our perception of the work that needs to be done in the name of privacy, those changes have all come about by way of either a journalist who's willing to use FOIA to get records to see what data companies really have, and then going through the work to figure out what are they saying on their privacy policy and what does their product look like, and then how do those things reconcile with what I'm seeing in this record. And and I feel like also like going back to my response about transparency, where we need to have at least two views where we're companies are on the hook for giving individual consumers and users more useful tools for accessing and seeing their data. There also needs to be a level of like transparency is useful for accountability and checking to giving regulators and lawyers and basically like people who understand the laws and regulations and even like consumer watchdog groups, the ability to get sensible and meaningful answers to questions that people reasonably have. So like when I see different, so for example, like I love Kashmir Hill's work. I feel like so she's since 2012 at least broken a ton of super interesting privacy stories about companies misusing, like companies having creative and perhaps bad uses of data. And like in the apps, it's like I constantly wonder, like in the absence of somebody, of people like Kashmir who are willing to get real curious about what's going on, like where would we be?
Yeah.
And like I'm thinking about like Max Schrems, and I know for like okay, so this is a we're doing this for consumers and for people who use the internet and just use technology broadly. Max Schrems as a law student, and like he kind of trying to like, he kicked down the first domino
Hmm.
of European regulators being able to hold Facebook to account on something so simple, not
Yeah.
deleting data when the button said delete.
Oh yeah. And
So
look,
like I feel like that's so trivial. It's like when I think about the way that like technology can be presented to us in a way that completely mismatches it or misrepresents what's behind it. And like I feel like we have to have mechanisms where people can say, hey, this doesn't feel right to me, and also not be on the hook for then proving that as an individual, but be able to hand it off in a meaningful way to say, somebody with experience, please check this out. Like I think
yeah,
of other institutions or other sort of places where we have to trust society to like to be safe. It's like I can go into a restaurant and I don't need to walk in and ask like, "Hey, does that burger have arsenic?" So I guess still the example from Ashkan Sultani, but like to me, it's a perfect thing. It's like right now we're basically saying in the privacy space that people need to use every app and use every service in a way of like, "Hey, is this going to kill me? Maybe. Hey, is this going to have an adverse event effect on me?" And that's just it's unreasonable. So maybe we get to a point where we don't need individual. Sorry, what's the thing called again? I'm not a lawyer.
the private right of action.
Private right of action. Maybe we get to a place where we no longer need that. Like maybe we get to a place where companies are so responsible with their data that we know, we all decide that it's time to deprecate that. Decide, it's time to move on. But I feel like right now we really need it.
Yeah, I'm with you, and I think that you can. I had a feeling the benefits outweigh the cost, but you kind of convinced me. I think they outweigh the cost by a lot. But consumers need a voice here, and they need to be able to say that that's kind of creepy. I don't want that.
Yeah. And also, like, I feel like we have to save this for another day because we're already going a little long. But I would be very curious to know if, like, I would want to trace back, are the voices who are saying that is bad the same voices that are highly paid lobbyists by big tech companies that are, out there trying to be sure that the small businesses can exist? It's like,
Yeah, yeah. I imagine it's the folks lobbying against it are the ones that have to deal with the class actions, and maybe it's a little inconvenient for them. But also, to your point, Actually, it might be more than that. It might be folks who don't want consumers to have a voice here. It's
Yeah.
interesting. I don't know the answer to it. Yeah, yeah. Hey, the
I
last
came
thing.
into privacy by way of security, so I'm always willing to like pull out my tinfoil hat.
Yeah, yeah.
It's part of
No,
my
no.
charm, I think.
I feel like you've been holding back on that actually. So maybe we need more of
Ooh, don't
that.
tempt me.
The other thing the federal privacy law does when it comes out is it really establishes the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, as our privacy body, the U.S. privacy
Mhm.
body. They are already, I think, they're one of the most well resourced privacy
Yeah.
teams out there, privacy lawyers out there, but they never had the tools. They had
Yep.
a tool, which was the
Yep.
FTC Act, and under the FTC Act, Section 5, I think, was about misleading and deceptive conduct. So everything the FTC did was about, hey, you didn't say what you said you're going to do, and they
That's right.
used that to protect consumer privacy.
Yeah.
Now they'll have comprehensive federal privacy law that they can really use. And in conversations with the FTC and kind of seeing them out there in events, I think they really care.
Hmm.
I think they're genuine about telling people where they're going to enforce.
Yeah.
I've met with a lot of folks who are lawyers now, or always have been lawyers, but used to be FTC lawyers, and now have joined law firms. And they say, yeah, look, we actually care about this, but we look to make examples of companies as well, right? Like who's really egregious. And I want to,
Yeah.
on our next session, Maritza, like unpack some of where the FTC has been focused and talk
Hmm.
through some of those cases and just do it at do it at a simple level. And yeah, so let's do that next time. Let's see where
Looking
this
forward
federal
to it.
bill goes. Like it'll be super cool if it passes. I think
Yeah.
it's looking good. We'll see. Who knows? Private right action might kill it. People might not want that. These lobbyists might win on that. Who knows? Let's keep it
That would be interesting.
one side.
Our conversations motivated me to look into it a little more. So
Mhm.
I'm like, yeah, what are the substantive concerns about that?
Love it.
Yeah.
Love it.
Thank you so much. It was really fun.
Thanks, Marissa, as always. Yeah, have a good one. Thanks, everybody.